Thank you. Okay. So I'm gonna have to abridge some of this stuff. Now, I am happy that so many of you guys are here. Welcome, welcome. My name is Rashaad Johnson, and I'll be presenting you guys Decolonizing the DigiSpace, Understanding Indigenous Peoples in Gaming and Pop Media. So, to give you a little bit about me, I'm an educator based out in Baltimore, Maryland. I have my bachelor's in game studies that I received at the University of Baltimore, wherein I decided to increase my studies at the University of Notre Dame, Maryland University, getting my master's in teaching. I am thankfully in my student teaching, so this is my last semester. Focused in special education and history. So my research area focuses on several topics, most notably games, media, and culture, video game history and preservation, and modern indigenous studies. And just a little bit about me as far as games go, my top 5 series in no particular order: Fire Emblem, Megami Tensei, Drakengard Nier, Legend of Zelda, and Onimusha. So, this is going to be a discussion that involves everybody. So before I get started, what do you think of when you hear the term indigenous or native? Yes?
Existing cultures that were there before the colonization period.
Okay, yeah. I think that's pretty much like what everyone thinks of. So pre-existing cultures that have been there long before other people have gotten there, other people. Yes?
Maybe not just like sort of cultures that are still alive, but more followed by people that are still really closely related to where they originated.
Right. So I think that's like a big thing that people tend to forget, which we will talk about a little bit in this presentation, that these people are still alive. But much like the elves in Lord of the Rings, people seem to think that they fucked off and just went into the dying lands. And I'll do one more, yes.
Groups of people that usually don't have their own official nation state.
Yes. So a lot of tribes, there are over 500 recognized tribes, federally recognized tribes in the United States, with several hundred more that are state recognized. And there are still some that are not recognized at all. So the reason why I bring this up is because back in 2018, one of the biggest games Square Enix popped out hit the market, Nier Automata. This game sold tens of millions of copies and revolutionized the way that we think of gaming as a narrative. In particular, one thing that I enjoyed the most was the songstress Emmy Evans' tweet. Back in 2018, she noted that one of her renditions of Weight of the World was sung partly in Chamikuro. This is important because Chamikuro is an indigenous language now extinct in South America. The last speaker to have spoken it died in the mid-2010s, and with it, all practicing speakers. While the language has been codified, and while I do commend Emmy Evans' approach to her music, I do often wonder what it would be like if indigenous people had a chance to speak up for themselves. Too often do we see indigenous artwork co-opted, whether that's Victoria's Secret donning a bunch of white women inside of headdresses from like Plains Indians, or people like Sally Anderson adopting Maori culture, more like appropriating. And despite the fact that people have told her and similar people in New Zealand, Aotearoa, that this is unacceptable behavior, people still continue to adopt these cultural icons without understanding the actual history and tradition that goes into them. And so the reason why this is important is because indigenous people from across the world, whether that's Native Americans, First Nations people in Canada, the Ainu in Japan, they have been voiceless for quite some time due to cultural hegemony and imperialism from dominating cultures. In particular, I want to look at this from the lens of gaming and pop media because depictions of indigenous peoples as well as other minority people have been routinely shown to lead to positive changes, including but not limited to promoting diverse experiences in the workplace, indigenous safety and sovereignty, and cultural preservation. And so we're going to look at this from a couple of perspectives. So the main goal is going to be identifying the history of indigenous peoples within pop culture, whether that's gaming, comics, radio, TV, whatever. And we're gonna look for three key things. We're gonna look for places where Native voices fit in the development cycle, places wherein colonization and Indigenous storytelling meet and diverge, and looking for methods that Indigenous peoples themselves can take to promote their own stories. So, before we delve too deeply into it, a couple of housekeeping things. Now, I am quite sure that like a lot of people have heard a bunch of different names for Native peoples, whether that's Indians, Amerindians, First Nations, Aborigines. The reason why I bring this up is because it's important to understand that words have power. What you call a person can determine whether or not they'll be treated as people. For example, in Japan, the Ainu are often called Inu, which, for those who know, is Japanese for dogs. A lot of Japanese politicians like to play stupid to this idea, but we should also know that Japan in particular likes to play politics. They've been doing so for over 150 years as they try to expel a people they have yet to expel completely. And so, with that being said, I will be using the term indigenous to refer to people as a whole. I will also be using the names that tribes themselves have recognized, both their in-name as well as the name outsiders call them. And I will also be using the term Indian. Now, I know a lot of people have different feelings about this. However, in proper American documentation, as well as some tribes themselves, they have adopted the term Indian into their culture. So, on one hand, yikes, but on the other hand, when you call a person something for hundreds of years, do not be surprised when they adopt that name. It's like if you call a person a monster all your life, they're going to come out as a monster. So, I should also warn you that this is going to be a heavy topic. This will depict topics involving historical violence, crimes against women and children, and racial violence. While I will encourage you to stay if you can handle it, I also understand that this is a particularly harrowing time. So if you would like to step out for this one, hopefully I'll see you guys later at the con. Thank you for coming either way. We're good? All right, cool, let's go in. So first I'm going to start with the Indigenous Americans themselves. As I said, starting out, this is a not covered topic. I was trying to think of words that are clever, but not really. So when we think of Native Americans, we kind of often think of them as, like I said, elves that fucked off to the dying lands. You know, we get a little bit of Mayflower, Pilgrims, yada yada, and then maybe if we're good boys and girls, we go and talk about them for cowboys and Indians, and then we don't talk about what they did in the 20th century. We don't talk about the fact that they're still alive. They're just... And there are a couple of reasons for that. Historically speaking, to put it plainly, Indigenous Americans have been screwed over by the system. Take, for example, the Indian Removal Act, which came out at a time of President Andrew Jackson, a known white supremacist. This man helped usher in the Trail of Tears, a death march, one of several that the United States bore witness to. Despite the fact that many white Americans at the time held conflicting feelings about this, Andrew Jackson knowingly, illegally, took these people off their lands from the southeastern United States and told them to fuck off to Oklahoma, where they knew that the land was barren and uninhabitable. Oftentimes when we think of this, we wonder why exactly, because we're not really taught why he did this. Part of the reason, and a major reason, is because the southeastern United States is known for being King Cotton. Oftentimes when we think of King Cotton, we think of black history. However, it's important to recognize that the land was fertile and originally Native Americans' lands. And so the people who actually held like reasonable resistance alongside rebellious slaves oftentimes fought against white Americans, especially Andrew Jackson himself. Now, a lot of people think like, oh, they just left off. But no, Indigenous people resisted in their own ways. Some people like Sequoyah, for example, adopted white tendencies, such as practicing an alphabetical language, adopting white clothing, and even adopting slavery. Others still adopted other methods, particularly violent ones. For example, The Seminoles in Florida resisted imperial control for decades. From 1816 to 1858, Seminole Indians, together with their black allies, made American troops fight like hell for whatever land that they decided they wanted to steal. To this day, the Seminole natives are still alive and kicking in Florida, as well as other parts of the United States. Still, the fight was not yet won. Canadian Native Americans, as well as American Indians, would face a special hell, one reserved for them until the 1990s, residential schools. This horrifying institution was perpetualized by Richard Henry Pratt, a brigadier general in the American Army, and the architect of this living hell. These schools saw several atrocities, including linguicide, sexual exploitation of Native children, sensory deprivation via solitary confinement, and they forced the children to dig their own graves and would never report the fact that they died there. These institutions, funded by Catholic universities as well as American government institutions, never really saw that much justice and continue to struggle to face justice to this day. So from the 1880s to 1997, while everyone was playing their Nintendo systems and everything, Native Americans held a terrible, terrible fate. Inspired by 17th century Catholic missionaries, people like Brigadier General Richard Henry Pratt, as well as the Canadian Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, created policies that would force Indigenous Americans, whether that's those in the United States, Canada, or Mexico, to adopt white leanings, whether that was cultural dresses or the native language of those particular places, whether that was English in the United States or Spanish in Mexico. And we never really saw anyone come out with these stories because oftentimes Indigenous children's struggles were often ignored. That was until recently, in particular in 2021, where 215 dead children were found underneath a school in Ontario. Still, it was a lot to endure, and we're going to talk about some stuff that happened in the 20th century. On one hand, the 20th century was a harrowing experience still. For example, Plessy v. Ferguson, another case that we think of when we think of black history, also affected Indigenous Americans too. It outlawed, for example, their ability to go into white institutions, and it actually limited them in ways different from black Americans. For example, they couldn't really retreat to their native lands because they were gone. They couldn't necessarily participate in white society because they were not white. And so oftentimes, for example, the Choctaw who were still in Georgia often retreated to the swamps that were there, subsisting on their own. You also had things like the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934. Attitudes towards Indigenous Americans started changing around this time. However, not by much. On one hand, that act instituted aid towards various federally recognized tribes. However, some, like the Navajo, refused the aid on account of the fact that the Bureau of Indian Affairs forced them to slaughter all of their livestock. Still, it wasn't all terrible. For example, you had women like the Afro Ojibwe sculptor Mary Edmonia Wildfire Lewis. Her art is pristine. I highly recommend that you check it out. Her sculptures were not only famous inside of the United States, but she took her art experiences to Rome, where it is one of the only expressions of Afro-Indigenous art to be held in high regard worldwide. You had plenty of other people too. For example, Afro-Indigenous woman Olivia Ward Bush Banks was known for being an amazing poet and playwright. Her poem, Driftwood, and her plays like Indian Traits, which was left unfinished, highlighted a lot of experiences of Afro-Indigenous people that to this day aren't particularly known very well due to the fact that they're intersecting histories that are often not talked about, but should still be remembered. You also had Hollywood. In this particular time, a lot of people don't really give credit where credit is due to early Hollywood's risings when it came to Indigenous Americans. James Young Johnson was a Nanticoke film actor. His pursuits helped lay the foundation for the Western, a genre that we still hold in high regard with people like Clint Eastwood to this day. You also had radio. Radio helped provide indigenous sovereignty through people like Don Whistler, a Meskwaki Indian who decided to create his own first Indian-led radio station, the WNAD. By the time the 1940s to 50s rolled around, we saw a lot of these media productions getting in big swing. Films like, for example, the docudrama Nanook of the North highlighted Inuit peoples and their experiences. On one hand, this was great to expose the American people to these far northern peoples that somebody in, say, Chicago or Baltimore wouldn't know about. On the other hand, it's the fact that they don't know anything about it that the director was able to co-opt their narrative into some fetishized experience that didn't actually happen. Oftentimes, he would, for example, frame shots as if they were happening right then and there, when in reality, he just staged them. You also had famous shows on the radio like The Lone Ranger. This saw the noble savage take shape. You had things like Tonto, the loyal Indian who would help his white ally, while at the same time the actor for the film version went on to create his own indigenous-led organization that promoted indigenous media in the mid-1900s, often looking back negatively on his role as Tonto. And lastly, you also had news and journalism. Oftentimes people think of media, they forget, well, this is media for them too. So we had places like Maclean's Magazine and the NYT, they demonized indigenous communities both in Canada and the United States. But you also had places like the Tlingit and the Indian Advocate who promoted indigenous sovereignty. Still, the fight was mixed to say the least. You had the Hays Code, for example. Oftentimes when we think of the Hays Code, we think of like the Puritan film era, the 1930s, and to an extent this is still true. For example, in 1946, the film Duel in the Sun showcased a half-native woman named Pearl Chavez. Her role would ultimately have her sacrifice her life at the end of the film. Oftentimes, well, if you're a non-white character, you either die for the white character or you kill yourself out of grief for your white lover. You also had plenty of instances in comics and animated film. What makes the Red Man Red in Peter Pan, for example, is often a well-regarded song outside of indigenous circles for whatever reason. And so this culminates into a lot of experiences that pissed off a lot of American Indians. They have been sick and tired of being sick and tired, and so between corruption inside of tribal governments and corruption inside of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they created the American Indian Movement. The American Indian Movement, still to this day, sees a lot of headway in protecting American Indian rights. For example, tired of the fact that Western institutions have failed them in the education of their children, they created survival schools like Hearts of the Earth, which was started in an effort to connect urban Indians to their roots. You also had the Scoop era, a time in the 50s and 60s where social workers would kidnap indigenous children and adopt them into white families. Oftentimes, Native families would be broken up. And so, in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act was passed, which allowed tribal governments to oversee whether or not children would actually be able to be adopted outside of the tribe. They would do everything in their power to make sure that child stays on tribal land, whether that's being raised by another relative or being raised by somebody in the community, because when you rip someone out of their homeland, when you rip somebody out of where they called home, they will lose everything and everything that made them not only a person, but made them them. You also had Nixon sign the Self-Determination Education Assistance Act of '75. This is important because it put indigenous education on par with non-indigenous children. This also includes things like access to technology and development. Finally, we get to the development of video games and where this all coalesces. To put it plainly, this was also shit. Gaming tech over time became something slowly but surely popular by the 1970s. Once the 80s hit around, disgruntled Atari programmers left the company and went to work for Activision. We also had instances of, well, raunchy-ass games being developed like Mystique, a game where the player is tasked with dodging obstacles in order to get the ability to rape a Native American woman that's tied up on a flagpole. You played as George Custer, by the way. I hope this... Needless to say, this game is terrible, and also it didn't really sell that well and was condemned by both Indigenous and women activists. But it wasn't the only game that decided to adopt this type of language. While not as abundant as their modern counterparts on account of the fact that video game preservation needs to get better, discussion for later, games like The Legend of Apache Gold, for example, had the players rob the grave of dead chieftains. You also had Indian Battle, where players played cowboys and Indians, a game tied to the romanticization of Western sheriffs pacifying the violent Indian. Over time, we would come to realize that, unfortunately, due to several decades of pacifying these savage people, we now have a people who are belittled and often forgotten. The same is true inside of Japan. When you think of Japanese, what do you think of? Sometimes you might think of someone who looks like Satoru Iwata, a Yamato game designer who's held in high regard. But there's also other people as well. Yoshihiro Akiyama is a Zenkichi Korean MMA fighter. These people have been in Korea, some of them have been in Korea for centuries. Others still have migrated over there during the 20th century. You also have people like Ariana Miyamoto, an Afro-Japanese woman who won Miss Japan back in 2015. And even though she's the one and only Blasian person to have actually done this, and she is still more Japanese than she is American on account of being born and raised in Japan, Japanese Twitter looks at her very poorly, to say the least. And you also have people like Shigeru Kayano, an Ainu Diet member, the one and only Ainu Diet member, in fact, who helped campaign for indigenous rights in Japan. So, how many of you have watched Golden Kamuy? In that case, this should be familiar to you a little bit. So the Ainu are indigenous peoples native to Hokkaido, the land that they call the Ainu Moshir. But they are also native to the Sakhalin Islands and the Kuril Islands over in Russia. They call themselves the Utari, other words, people. Currently, only 13,000 of them exist as of 2017, although the number is likely higher due to intermixing with the Yamato population. They are one of two indigenous peoples native to Japan, the other being the Ryukyuans, also known as the Okinawans. They possess a culture unique to themselves, including religion cemented around the Kamui instead of the Kami. You also have the soot tattoos seen on the women's faces, and the fact that their language is completely different from Japonic languages. These people possess their own culture and unique traditions. For example, you have the famous Iomante festival, wherein bear cubs would be taken into the village and raised for their cubhood until they would sacrifice them to the Kamui, in hopes that the bear spirit would send them reverence into the spirit world. You also had traditional marriage ceremonies wherein the people would sing traditional songs and wish the family well on their new journey as a couple. While the history of Ainu-Yamato relations dates back well into the 1700s, I'm going to start during the Meiji era, in particular because this is where we see a lot of expansion into Hokkaido. For example, Emperor Meiji saw survey expeditions to Hokkaido in order to scout out the unknown lands. Oftentimes, the autonomy, which was granted during the 1700s to the Ainu, would be stripped away slowly but surely by both the Russian and the Japanese governments. The Ainu saw a lot more intense land grabs, assimilation, and atrocities to their people, all to placate Yamato and Russian nationalism. Back in 1904, in fact, Ainu people were shipped over to St. Louis's human zoos as exhibits for Americans and other world powers to see and portray as barbarians. So we have things like the Ainu being forcibly shaven because they would have long and sometimes craggly hair compared to the Yamato population. You had the Ainu being forcefully assimilated into Yamato education systems, very similar to the United States with its own Indigenous Americans. And you have the human zoos back in 1904. The Ainu were, like other native peoples, portrayed in ways that often romanticize or demonize their experiences. The group that was sent over to St. Louis included the Sengia Himura, who was 57, his wife Sentoku, who was 54, Kutarage, who was 39, and his wife Shutraket, who was 37, and their 2 children, Kin and Kiku. A young couple, Yazo Ozawa, who was 23, and his wife Shirake, who was 18, and a single man, Korobete, who was 26. These human zoos were useful tools in portraying imperialism as a necessary step in civilizing the savages. Incidentally, this was also the first time that Native Americans and Ainu people met. So this was the second time Americans got to meet Japan. The Ainu saw their own identities fade over time during the 20th century. Many were forced to be petty laborers, completely different to their hunter-gatherer natures. Many were forced still to be landless, penniless, and treated like animals. In 1870, the modern family registry system helped identify Ainu as Japanese. This was a way to take away their cultural sovereignty and to assimilate them into Japanese culture. This played a little bit differently from American Indians because white Americans still saw indigenous people as their own, while at the same time, not really. It was a weird space to be in, and it's still a weird space today, where tribal governments are supposed to be sovereign, but not really, except that they are, but they're still dependent nations. It's weird. This was further solidified in 1899 with the Hokkaido Aboriginal Protection Act. This act helped label the Ainu as former Aborigines. Why do you think the word former is important here?
Another way of forced assimilation.
Yes. What else?
They don't exist, they don't have rights.
Yes.
If they're former, it means that they're not currently Aborigines, which means that, like you're saying, at some point you might have been considered native or original to this land, but no more. Now it's all everybody's equally entitled to it.
Right.
Kind
So
of stripping away their initial claim.
right. So it was a way to adopt them into Yamato culture as if they had no history whatsoever. Ainu people, unlike the Yamato, did not write their histories down. They were passed down orally, like a lot of indigenous peoples.
To neutralize their identity.
Right. So it was, in the end, successful for quite some time. We still are trying to piece together a lot of Ainu writings, like those coming from the Waka poet Iboshi Hokuro. Over time, the Ainu fought back. They fought back through efforts like the Ainu Kyokai, the Hokkaido Ainu Association, as a means of regaining their former Aboriginal status. But they fought in different ways. For example, the musician Oki Kano helped blend Yamato and Ainu cultures on account of being from both an Ainu father and a Yamato mother. His father actually is right here to the right, Biki Tsunezawa, who was a sculptor and an artist of many talents who created the Ainu flag that you saw earlier. The colors signify a cornite hunting poison, while the white on the pattern helps signify the snows of the Hokkaido winter. You also have people like Tatsujiro Kuzuno, who helped to avoid confrontation with the Yamato population as a means of just preserving what they could. Again, these people did not have their cultures written down. They didn't have their luxury like that. So they preserved what they could through oral traditions, trying to get their children to remember who they were. Over time, though, the innovations from Hollywood came into Ainu media and pop culture. For example, you have the film Jacquemin and Tetsu. Ainu culture seeped into this 1964 film that was part comedy, part adventure. It had things, what was one scene on there? It was like the two men here were arguing amongst each other, but they couldn't understand each other because one was Ainu and speaking the Ainu language and one was Japanese speaking Japanese language, and they kind of went back and forth with each other. You also had films and documentaries like The Ainus of Japan, that was in 1913. This helped give a more historical lens that helped lend credence to the whole former Aborigines talk. You also had in 1948 a revelation by many Ainu peoples that their traditional music is kind of gone. And so a lot of people at the time considered it a luxury to even hear traditional Ainu songs. Individuals like Dr. Kondo also utilized newspapers and magazines to educate the public about the Ainu too. Following World War II, a lot of changes started happening inside of Japan. For example, the emperor was no longer a god king, he had to get a constitution, no more nobles, the good stuff. There was also the Treaty of Mutual Cooperation and Security between the United States and Japan, which saw critical disdain from both the Yamato and the Ainu population. But the Ainu saw this as an advantage because they could use this act to fight for their own rights. So, some like Ryu Ota, for example, divorced the movement from Ainu beliefs and just started to adopt violent extremes. Others still, like Yichi Nomura, helped preach for coexistence with the Yamato at the UN General Assembly back in 1992. As the 1899 Hokkaido Aboriginal Protection Act kind of died out, Ainu educators too decided that they were going to take matters into their own hands. They created textbooks, they created their own language schools, they created their own means of protecting their children, educating them on what it meant to be Ainu before Yamato expansion. Since 1974, the first Hokkaido Utari welfare measures put up immense financial assistance to Ainu families. The Yamato would help subsidize their education, they would help them get food and supplies needed, and they would help them live independently from the Yamato government. So as you can see, attitudes started slowly changing, but it was only in Hokkaido. There were also other measures that were taken up. For example, you had people like Yumeko Ando using her singing prowess and her ability to play the mukari to help preserve traditional Ainu songs. In fact, how many of you have watched Samurai Champloo? If you stayed a little bit for the credits for one of the episodes with Okaru, you would have probably heard her song Pakumbre Uk. It was a posthumous honor given to Ando following the end of her life. We also had the Hokkaido High School Teachers Association release textbooks in 1982. One was called The Discussing Minorities in Japan with Students, the Current Situation and Guides for Teaching. This helped Yamato teachers understand what it meant to be Ainu and some of the ramifications that were going on as a result of forced assimilation. At the time, attitudes were still changing, so any good coverage helped a lot. You also had private radio stations in Sapporo being able to broadcast a lot of radio programs in Ainu. Traditionally, at this point, it was unheard of to talk in one's native language like that. So having the ability to get that private radio station, even if only in a couple of territories, helped cement some of the language that was often ripped out from their mouths, both literally and figuratively. So here you see things like Yamato and Ainu children learning together in an inclusive classroom, being integrated in one curriculum. You also have political activists like Biki Sunezawa participating in Ainu rights marches back in the late 90s. You also had the Nibutani Ainu language schools open in 1983. The mission for them was to not only teach primary and secondary schoolers Ainu culture, tradition, and language, but it was also meant to foster pride in their identity. It's kind of similar to the Black Power movement. So once we get to the 80s, this is when we start seeing some of those histories pop up into Yamato media. For example, in the 80s, Ainu leaders, when they connected with international indigenous people, they helped kind of share ideas amongst them to see what was similar and different with their experiences. In particular, you had Ainu people meeting with Native Americans who met with the Sami, and they created their own little wing within like the UN to help promote indigenous rights and sovereignty across the board. They attended the 81 Third World Conference of Indigenous Peoples in Australia and the 1992 UN International Year of World Indigenous Peoples. They helped hash out their own constitution that held various peoples accountable for what they've done to indigenous peoples. Simultaneously, you had gaming tech popping up, and it was only getting better and better. You had Nintendo in '83 pretty much cementing their hold of the gaming culture once the video game crash occurred. So you had other companies too take shape. You had the Kadokawa Shoten, that was, which one was that? That was for the publications wing for manga and novels and such. You also had Madhouse take hold in Shueisha and SNK. Ultimately, these studios would be the ones that first shaped Ainu presence. So you had some people like Usui Hukuro who had a little bit of Ainu influence in his design. You also had Jiro, a protagonist from a hidden gem I recommend everyone to watch called Dagger of Kamui. It's kind of a piece of lost media. I tried to find any copies, digital or like physical, here and there, but I'm not paying like hundreds of dollars for a physical copy of it. Jiro in particular is interesting because he was half Ainu and half Yamato. The reason why this is interesting is because to this day, Hafu, the word that they use for mixed race people, aren't particularly held in high regard, whether that's Yamato and white, Yamato and black. Definitely not going to be Yamato and Ainu. But the film was well regarded in a lot of circles because it's a tale of revenge, it's a tale of action, it's a tale that anybody can get into. And then you also had later on in the early 2000s Samurai Champloo. The character Okaru had a strong connection with the main character Mugen because they were both indigenous people in Japan. They were able to bond over their shared love of music because Okaru was playing on his string instrument and Mugen heard the song and thought it was very familiar. He never actually heard the song before, but the reason why he thought it was familiar is because they had that shared experience of colonization. And so one game that I want to point out in particular is Samurai Showdown, a game that came out in 1993 and is one of the most pivotal fighting games to have ever come out. So in particular, I want to focus on the two characters, Nakoru and Rimuru, two Ainu characters that are very popular in Yamato media. In particular, the depiction of these two girls falls heavily into Japanese shoujo styles that are particularly antithetical to Ainu dress and culture. Studying this helps reveal a couple of key things. For example, it reveals the growing gap between Ainu people's actual history and their romanticized history. The fact that this is a long-standing series that came from the 90s and that this is, 93, 3, 13, 23, over 30, over 3 decades old, helps show you that, stuff like this gets cemented and it helps and harms indigenous peoples as well as other people when it comes to depictions, be it good or ill. A year after Nakuru's debut in 1933, Kayano Shigeru, a well-known activist, started teaching people about Ainu ethics, Ainu culture, Ainu language, and Ainu values that run antithetical to Nakuru and Rimuru. This isn't to say, like, if you like these two characters, you're somehow an evil colonist. Like, no, it's fine. I'm pretty sure people play Mortal Kombat named like Nightwolf. Like, it doesn't make you like evil for liking these particular things, but it is important to recognize where these stereotypes come from, as it helps actually make you a more nuanced and better person to be around. So, that was a lot of history. Kind of want to take some time to process all of that, and more importantly, to shift over to now. The reason why I wanted to cover all of that history is because all of those experiences bleed into both indigenous and non-indigenous media. And so you have indigenous people now understanding the power of media and ways to use it to co-opt their own legacy and their own traditions. For example, Alan Turner, an Afro-Native creator, has been utilizing his understanding of game design, education, and culture to promote it in various universities and K-12 places in order to promote indigenous storytelling, Black power, and, of course, history through role-playing games. And it's also important to recognize this because of the cultural shift right now with AAA games. You know, AAA games, to say the least, have been pretty Like, on one hand, do not get me wrong, the games that we've been getting for the past 5-6 years, like from a technical perspective and to an extent, like a narrative perspective, are 10 times better than what we had like 20 years ago. Persona 3 Reload, Metaphor ReFantazio, Fire Emblem Three Houses, like, these games are good. These games are perfect. They're great. On the other hand, we also have to recognize the conditions that these games are being made in, whether it's not recognizing basic human rights or recognizing creators and the role that they play in, you know, creating things that we all know and love, and now they're getting replaced with robots and AI. And so people are now moving over to indie and AA gaming, which is great for indigenous people because it allows them to get their own space. And so I want to take some time to look at a couple of examples. So for everyone who's familiar with Shin Megami Tensei, how many of you have played 5? Okay, good. Light spoiler, I guess, not really, but putting it out there. You have those little demon conversations that sometimes happen when they're coming from the same pantheon. In this case, Churanoop and Kuropakuru, they both share some dialogue about how times have started changing over the many years of being adopted into Yamato culture. It's kind of part meta, part like historical meta, part gaming meta, because it has actually been a lot of time in the games world because it kind of takes a lot of bits and pieces from SMT 3, but it also takes a lot of pieces from actual Ainu history. And so Kuropakura is like telling Chiro to like be encouraged, endure, and figure out ways to live and have themselves prosper in this particular society. You also have games like Never Alone, an indigenous-led game made by the Inupiat. Together with 40 Alaskan Native elders, storytellers, and community members, they created a game that is long-lasting and is long-lauded. In fact, I believe the game is getting a sequel, already has the sequel, sometime soon, like this year, if it hasn't already come out yet. I didn't keep up too much with the sequel news for it. But I do know that the game was given like BAFTA nominations, regional nominations, as well as several awards under its own belt. You also have games like Assassin's Creed 3. The main character in that game, Raton Aketon, is known throughout the Assassin's Creed community as being very stoic, very calm, very introspective, and he's actually regarded pretty well when it comes to indigenous media depiction because he was made in consultation with Mohawk peoples. two historians in particular helped develop the game. You had Teoswatoni Thomas Deere and Akiwatekaka Martin. They helped develop the game in order to make sure that, you know, the developers are including cultural markers that need to be there, Xing out particular narratives that appear too Western, making sure that, you know, we're not doing the whole tomahawk chop nonsense that's gone. We're done with this. And this was extremely helpful because the game went on to sell 7 million units worldwide by its first few months. People love this stuff. Assassin's Creed 3 is probably one of the most well-regarded in the whole series. And then you had expansions that led onto those colonial narratives from marginalized perspectives, whether that's Avedine de Grandpré in Liberation or Adewale in Freedom Cry. You also had Pokemon Legends. This one is an anomaly to me. On one hand, I do like the mythological nods, whether that's like Kimon Kamui and Typhlosion's connection, or Seacop Kamui and the connection with the Decidueye. On the other hand, these are easily lost if you don't actually, you know, delve into the culture and the history. You're kind of just giving like historical cameos. What can you do with that? And I know somebody's going to be like, well, it's Pokemon, you know, it's a kid's game. Like, can you really delve into genocide in a kid's game? Counterpoint, how many of you have watched Avatar: The Last Airbender? Kids aren't stupid. As a teacher, kids are not stupid. Sure, like, they're undereducated, but they pick up on pattern recognitions like the rest of us.
We all speak as former children. Kids are not stupid.
As former children, kids are not stupid. They picking up what we put down.
I think in that game also, they have Pearl Clan and they have the Diamond Clan, which are supposed to be representations, I think, of Ainu and Yamato. Like, culture,
Yes.
right?
Yeah, so you see this a lot in like the attire of the game, the situation like the Diamond and Pearl clan, and so you get little bits and pieces of this, and the fact that your character is out there exploring and being on an expedition to chart the unknown lands of Hokkaido, Hisui, my bad. But at the same time, you know, tell it like it actually happened. Your player base is telling you, you know, we like it when you have these historical nods. You like it when you have these historical nods. Actually delve a little bit into the history. I'm not saying show me dead bodies for a kid's game, but like, again, kids aren't stupid. Which is why you have games like The Raven and the Light, which honestly confronts what happened in residential schools. It's a horror game that takes place in Mother Mary's residential school for Indian students. You also have the instance that's a little bit more complicated, like Chief Poundmaker being included in Civ 6. The headman, Milton Tatusis, summed it up pretty accurately. He took a very nuanced stance at this. On one hand, he's actually surprised that Civ 6 actually took a lot of cultural nods in depicting Chief Poundmaker, because unlike other characters, his is more so of a pacifist takeover. Like, it's more so involving trade and negotiation. On the other hand, he also warned that these depictions are harmful because indigenous people were not like white conquerors taking over a land like this. Indigenous government is not the same thing as European-style government. That's not to say that indigenous people didn't take over lands from other people. The Aztec exist. But you have to understand their understanding of government, their understanding of history and culture is completely alien to the colonizers that came over and established Western hegemony. I don't think I need to go over this one too much. Brave, just look at it. It's shit. Again, Plains Indian headdresses, you got Tonto speak, you got the character literally named Brave. Moving on. You also have the Oregon Trail, which is a classic staple in millennial and Gen Z culture, blah, 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 you died of dysentery. So, the reason why I have to go over that one in particular is because educators actually still use this game for whatever reason. It's not particularly culturally or historically accurate. And I thought we were actually done with the game. So why haven't we gotten rid of it, especially when there's a better game called When Rivers Were Trails, which tells the indigenous perspective of white expansion through Manifest Destiny. I encourage it. Go play it. Going back into Mega 10, something that I really liked was Soul Hacker's depiction of indigenous culture. So there's a lot. I like Soul Hackers and Devil Summoner as a whole because it focuses on like smaller local folk tales like La Llorona, which I was actually surprised about when I first played Soul Hackers because I'm so used to like Zeus and Hades and like the big gods. I wasn't really like, I was actually surprised that they started focusing on like little legends and stuff like that. Kazuma Kaneko in particular wanted to combine cyberpunk aesthetic with many local myths, most notably Native Americans, which you can see in the Algonquin Manitou and its comparison to Yahweh, which actually white priests have done when they started colonizing Algonquin lands way back in the day as well. Oftentimes we think of like white settlers forcing Christianity upon Native Americans, we don't actually think about the fact that like Algonquin peoples had a very similar setup when it comes to like monotheism. That's why the religion was like easier for them to push onto Algonquin peoples. In fact, there was actually a settler priest, I'm forgetting the name of, that noted this in one of his journals during his missionary work. And then you also have characters like Red Dead Redemption 2's Charles Smith. This one I am torn about. On one hand, I know that Smith is a well-regarded character. People have been asking for him to be like the main character for like Red Dead Redemption 3. People love him in like online spaces. On the other hand, I can't particularly see why. Considering the fact that Red Dead Redemption 2 lends itself to historical realism, let's be honest. It's kind of shit when it comes to depictions. You have an Afro-Native person that doesn't know his, like, he doesn't know his cultural roots, he doesn't know his cultural land. He finds camaraderie and friendship in two white outlaws, outlaws of whom at the time would have actually been like fucking pissed that not only an Indian would try to like be friends and chummy with them, but also a black Indian at that. The reason why we had a lot of like Afro-Natives at the time was because black slaves were fleeing into tribes like the Seminole to get away from the plantations and from white people as a whole. So why do we have Charles Smith out here pretending like he's gonna be buds with this? Especially when many outlaws later on in the 1800s were Confederates. Not the neo-Confederates that dress up today, like die-hard Confederates. That would have never flown in real life. And so when you have Red Dead Redemption 2 out here being used in college classrooms for history classes, you gotta start thinking about this stuff. So hopefully this mixture of like indie, AA, and AAA games helps you understand why this space is so important for indigenous people to co-op. For AAA games, it can be acclaimed to be inspired by indigenous culture, but they never actually give back to the places that they steal from. You also have the fact that indie games and AA games are more popular for indigenous people because they are either made wholly or predominantly by indigenous creators, and they're made in smaller teams, so you have better quality control. And oftentimes, more importantly, credit and sometimes monetary value gets sent back to the indigenous community as well. And then you also have collab games, which are kind of like the middle of the road. You kind of have where, in Assassin's Creed 3 case, you have historical consultations with a couple of people from a particular tribe. This is good if you're trying to do like quality control, but then it's like, how many of you seen Raya and the Last Dragon or heard of it? How many of you have kind of seen the fallout for that, where like a lot of Southeast Asian people had their opinions cut out because a lot of white people decided to get on Twitter and was like, well, actually, you should be impressed by the fact that they had two Southeast Asian words. Shut up. It's Disney. It's a white company. You do not get praise for loving millionaires and billionaires, people. It doesn't work like that. They're here to screw us all over. For more information, see our favorite Mario character, Luigi, from last month. And so we have a lot, and so as you see, we have a lot of reasons for why Indigenous communities should be interested in gaming and gaming communities. You have tribes working with game developers and game studies scholars to promote cultural preservation. You have the fact that games and media like My Grandmother's Lingo are not only cultural memoirs, but also personal ones too. You have games like Wind Rivers for Trails rewriting history and historical narratives to actually tell a more nuanced take. And you have some games like Solver Teams Reclaim out here teaching Ojibwe students, well, Ojibwe, a language that was, again, literally and figuratively ripped out from their mouths. And so now's the time where we go into ways that these narratives can be co-opted by Indigenous people. The reason why this is important is because Indigenous presence in pop culture is pretty limited, to say the least. In fact, I was trying to find data for it, and it too was extremely limited. For example, I had a little bit of data from GDC that showcased the fact that like less than 5% of Indigenous people actually work in the gaming industry, and that was as of like 2021. And it went even less than that by 2023. You also had the Annenberg Inclusion Initiative back in 2023 find that from 2007 to 2022, Indigenous people only made up 133 out of 62,224 speaking characters. So that's about 0.21%. Further still, only 99 of those roles were actually played by Indigenous actors. And even further still, only one of those were Indigenous-led characters, Danny Moonstar, who was played by Blue Hunt. And there's also a little bit of data on the comic side of things. I wanted to try to see if I could find that as well. From what I found on a statistical report, less than 1% exists, which even, I have to give that with a grain of salt, but I mean, it checks out. And so there are 4 ways I want to look at this. I want to look at this from the lens of education, job opportunities, the digital divide, and fandom culture. I'm looking at the situation for these 4 pillars because oftentimes we think of, well, why don't you guys just make your own media? Well, there are 4 reasons for that. Most people don't actually know how to like get into the gaming industry because they probably don't have gaming programs in their place or computer science programs. For example, if you're a native kid that grew up in Oklahoma on a reservation, not saying that you don't have anything, but your stuff is going to be pretty limited compared to some white kid that grew up in Massachusetts and went to MIT. So no, the game is never fair. If you choose to like adopt imagery inside your AAA games, your shit is going to be labeled woke or DEI. If you try to make your own narratives, this is going to be like the fallout on Twitter with Corey Kenshin, where people got pissy that he made his own stuff. Didn't you just tell us to go make our own stuff? So I want to look at this through education first. There are some problems when it comes to decolonizing education in the 21st century. For example, there's a lot of underrepresentation when it comes to Indigenous students in STEM. So when we had that big craze in like the 2000s, 2010s, you need to get into a STEM job. I want you to get into computer science. Great, now we're all in computer science and we don't have jobs. Do you know how many nursing students we got, and like, we had so many of them that people were able to rip them out during the pandemic. They weren't even certified yet, and they're out here treating patients. How many of them do you think were like Black or Native American, or like, you know, someone who wasn't like white? And this is important because 50% of white medical students go in with terrible preconceived notions of Black people in medicine to this very day. For more information, see Henrietta Lacks. You also have cultural barriers. Western institutions are antithetical to, 1, good education. Again, how many of you have actually like been in a classroom and studied like Indigenous education? Probably not, myself included. I had to go about this my own way because none of the schooling I had actually covered beyond Pilgrims, a little bit of Cowboys and Indians, fuck off to the Dying Lands. If nothing else, That being said, giving credit where credit's due, my third grade teacher did talk about King Philip's War. Really weird in third grade, but you also have the fact that, hot take, poverty is bad, and it exists too. Poverty affects people disproportionately, especially indigenous people in rural communities. And so these factors contribute to further harm to indigenous people. So on one hand, you have people like Matthew Griffin, an Afro-Native reenactor who's doing his best to showcase indigenous history of the Black Seminoles. On the other hand, you have lower enrollment in colleges and socioeconomic barriers helping to keep these people down. You also have the fact that, like, even if they gained access to equitable education in a PWI, a predominantly white institution, again, they do not teach the way that they're supposed to teach. And so, what do? Well, you have mentorship programs like Indigenous in the US or the Indigenous Tech Mentoring and Employment in Canada offering STEM education to Indigenous youth. They're out here like promoting Indigenous knowledge systems and Indigenous storytelling and Indigenous STEM practices. This is important because we also have white people co-opting theories and new innovations in education that my brother in Christ, Native people, have been telling you this. For more information, see the fires that are happening in California, and the reason why they're so bad is because, one, you adopted flammable trees that came out of Australia, and two, you started banning traditional ecological knowledge, which, had prescribed burns that could have helped stop this.
See, New Jersey, who does that all the time?
Exactly. And now all of a sudden it's like, oh, the original peoples, they knew what they were talking. Shut up. It's like I'm watching 2012, like Jesus. And then, again, you have games like Reclaim. They're great because they help revitalize a culture that was put down for centuries. Teaching Ojibwe, and you also have other games that are teaching other actual American languages. And lastly, you also have Congress trying to do something. I don't know what. They're supposed to actually be giving TCU's tribal colleges and universities money, but obviously that's not happening. Which is why it's very important for us to support bills like the National Advisory Council on Indian Education Improvement. This bill helps establish Indigenous presence because Indigenous individuals are going to be required to be on the board when it comes to setting financial statements. These policies are great because it encourages self-determination, it helps increase the knowledge pool for educational theory, and it's great for the fact that, well, I think we can all agree education directly tackles poverty. I don't know about you, but growing up in a system where people can actually read and write and do basic math is kind of cool. It's kind of hip, as the kids say. Well, why don't Native Americans just get into the gaming market? There are job opportunities for them. Again, there are so few records, it's startling. And so when they do actually have job opportunities in the era, you have pretendians like Buffy Sainte-Marie, who adopts Native culture and pretends to be Native American in order to get culture points and stuff. Because, yeah, white culture still fetishizes Indigenous figures. It got so bad that she even got adopted into a tribe after her death. So I don't even know how to judge that, because the next time I say, hey, she's not actually Native, somebody's going to be like, well, actually, she's card carrying. And so you can't really do anything with this. And also the fact that the game industry, honestly, hot take, I wouldn't recommend anyone get into that thing right now. How many of you have seen that lawsuit that happened a couple years ago with Activision Blizzard, where, the girl killed herself on a work retreat? And while she was doing that, guys were trading pictures of her genitals as trading cards. Yeah, I wouldn't recommend anyone get into this industry. But, I'm not going to, yuck your yum. I actually want you to be in it. It's just unfortunate that we have to deal with stuff like this. So we get a shallow idea pool. Again, Disney with Raya and the Last Dragon out here making perfect minority depictions when, it's shallow at best and it's made for a white audience. You also have continuous racist ideologies being promoted. And then you also have the fact that this industry, again, is unsustainable. Chances are in the next 5 years, I will be surprised to see a human working in game development because, companies like EA want to adopt an AI policy to replace 50% of their workforce, and that came out of the news as of last year. It's terrifying out here, Sarge. That's why organizations like Daniel Forward's Native Rising STEM Camp are important to increasing Indigenous education, especially when it comes to STEM careers. You also have Indigenous entrepreneurs like Mallory and Cam Yangwei, who are combining their artistic skills to help people understand First Nations history and get Native-made arts and goods and services. You also have the Sami people out there making great games like Skamba. This game is an action-adventure game and is the first of its kind created solely by a Sami team. You also have Two Falls, an indie game that showcases Indigenous Quebec culture. And I think it's actually the first of its kind in Quebec. And so the reason why this is all important is because it helps decolonize media. It gives Indigenous people a voice at the table. It helps increase Indigenous sovereignty. Creators like Dr. Elizabeth Lepense use projects like When Rivers Were Trails to counter colonist narratives on history and culture. And also, it creates financial autonomy. Look, when you have people like Bobby Kotick out here kicking back so much money to Republicans to make sure that people can't get into this industry and get his own policies put in place, I don't see why Hot Take the government could actually help support these Indigenous-led movements to actually tell American stories. Because again, they're the first Americans, are they not? And so, with all that being said, I hope that we can now understand why these things are important. Indigenous people now have a place at the table, or at least the opportunity to have the place at the table. With funding, institutional reconciliation, and aid from the federal government, we're able to get out here and actually promote these people's stories their own way. Whether that's buying and sharing indie games, understanding that the fans have more power than they actually think they do, or using online spaces to promote actual games and media that we want to see. It's cheesy, but be the change that you want to see in the world and yada, 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 and all that. And also, CEOs are bad. I'm not saying, but And before you guys go, here's some cool organizations and media that you should check out. If you have the time, I recommend checking out movies like Ainu Moshir or Sito's channel on YouTube that teaches Ainu language. I also recommend that you check out games like Hill Agency Purity Decay. It's a detective game that depicts Native futurism. I also recommend that you check out stuff like When Rivers Were Trails, which I plan on using in my own history classroom when we get to imperialism. Or organizations like Indigenous Game Devs, which helps support Indigenous game developers online to get them started and find jobs and find education institutions. So, with all that being said, I thank you guys for your time. I know that we started pretty late in the space, but I hope that you enjoyed. And also, real quick, I am currently doing a study right now on doing conventions after COVID. I plan on pushing this out to various convention organizers, and participants are always welcome. Please, please, please. Data is important in science from everybody. Let's make the data pool diverse, as it were.